Well, I don't think I need any introduction. So I want to move right into our presentation, which I'm very excited about. We have been trying to do this since the beginning of the pandemic. And in fact, Julianne and I went early in the pandemic to photograph the exterior of the Thomas Center, which was closed for some time to the public. But during that period, a new person came to town, Bonnie Lykes, who is going to talk today about the present and what is happening at the Thomas Center. She has become a docent there, and I'm looking forward to hearing about what I would call the future. I've done a little research. Well, I have a long history with the Thomas Center Associates. When Lucille Maloney, the wife of the dean who hired me, the law dean, asked me to become involved, I really had no choice. And I co-drafted the Articles of Incorporation for the Thomas Center Associates, and then I did the necessary paperwork to get them their 501c3 tax exemption, which is probably the most important thing I ever did for the Thomas Center Associates. In any event, I wanted to say that the histories of the University of Florida and the Thomas Center are inextricable. The common thread linking them is William Reuben Thomas. Born in Gainesville in 1866 and educated in multiple institutions outside the state, he received an A.B. degree from Vanderbilt University in 1888. He returned to Gainesville and assumed the chair of language at a co-ed military school, the Florida Seminary, East Florida Seminary, a building today by the, which is in the middle of the First Methodist Church. And if you stand in the street and look, you can see a brick structure with two colors of brick. That's the original Gainesville version of the East Florida Seminary. It was actually begun in Ocala before the Civil War, closed during the war, and then when it reopened in Gainesville. It was here that he held the rank of major and forever after was known as Major Thomas. Well, Major Thomas was elected mayor in 1901 when he was 35 years old, a post he held until 1907 when he chose not to rerun. The single most important event in Gainesville's history, its selection as the location of the University of Florida, occurred while Major Thomas was mayor and largely resulted from his efforts. On June the 5th, 1905, the Buckman Act, named for a state senator, consolidated 8 state-supported institutions of higher learning, including the East Florida Seminary of Gainesville, and these were all merged into 3 universities under the direction of a board of control, later renamed the Board of Regents. And those 3 institutions were the University of Florida in Gainesville for men, Florida State College for women in Tallahassee, now FSU for women, and Florida A&M for black students. Well, this is still the structure under which we operate. It's had a lot of permutations along the way, but the basic system created by the Buckman Act in 1905 is still the structure that we're using today, even though many more universities have been added. Well, Major Thomas led the Gainesville delegation in Tallahassee to try to get the university located here. And winning the competition resulted from the city's promise of free water forever, and I think they revoked that years ago, The proceeds from the sale of the East Florida Seminary buildings would come to the university, and Major Thomas pledged to donate his own land as a building site for the university. So you see immediately how important he was. Well, on the of the first two buildings on campus, one is named for Major Thomas, the other for Senator Buckman. Both were dedicated on the same day, September the 27th, 1906, although neither was fully complete at the time. And as a sidebar, when I first came to the university in 1962, I often passed a sign outside Buckman Hall indicating it was a National Historic Landmark. And I was suitably impressed. But 14 years later, when I began to teach historic preservation law and how to look up such listings, I learned this marker was a lie. I shared this with our central administration, and the marker disappeared. In 1906, another structure broke ground in northeast Gainesville, what would become Sun-Kissed Villa and later the Hotel Thomas. And our speaker will be talking about the Sun-Kissed Villa, later life, and the foundation, the function of the services there today. Further linking Sun-Kissed Villa with the University of Florida is the architect, William Augustus Edwards, a noted Atlanta-based architect. And in doing my research, I see that Wikipedia and other sources state that very confidently that the structure was designed by Edwards and built starting in 1910 in the classical revival style. Well, I always warned my law students about relying on Wikipedia or non-primary sources, and this is a good example because the building actually, the land was cleared in 1906, and the original owner of the property and the builder, Mr. Chase, died in 1909, and only the walls and the roof were on at that particular period. So it's unclear to me who the original architect was. It may have been Edwards, and it likely was because, of course, he had already done the first two buildings on the campus, which were dedicated in 1906. But I think there's some question there. In any event, Edwards was certainly the architect that Thomas worked with to complete it. Wikipedia also refers to it as classical revival style. I think it's Mediterranean revival. So again, beware of Wikipedia. It's a great starting point, but not necessarily a good ending point. Major Thomas bought the property, again, partially completed from the estate of Mr. Chase. They had been business partners. And the family finally moved in on February the 9th, 1910. Edwards was a very important architect for Gainesville and UF because he not only was the architect for those first two buildings, but he became the official architect for that board of control. So he was in charge of all buildings on all campuses, and that was, again, for the first 20 years, all done in the collegiate Gothic style. And that style was continued for another 20 years by his successor. That's why the original campus has such a unity in that collegiate Gothic style. Overcoming substantial financial difficulties, because this actually was going on when the Florida crash occurred, 2 years before the national crash. But overcoming financial obstacles, the Hotel Thomas opened its doors to guests on January the 10th, 1928, and was open as a hotel for 40 years. My first visit to the Hotel Thomas was for a law review banquet in October of 1962. Although I remember the speaker, Jack Matthews from Jacksonville, and I have no idea what he talked about. My memory from that first evening is of the eagle medallions in what is now called the Spanish Court. During the 1970s restoration, they were recast from the hotel originals, which also were plaster. And in 2009, New York artist Diane Boyensi, and I may have mispronounced that, I recall watching her work on them, restored the color magnificently. And they're still one of my favorite details of the hotel after 60 years. Well, when Gainesville went wet in 1963, the Hotel Thomas received liquor permit number 1.
That's right.
And created the Cornish Arms, which became the favorite bar among academics and graduate students. And until the closure in 1968, it was the lodging of choice for alumni returning for UF football weekends. Perhaps saddest to its closure, the old Gainesville families who regularly headed to the hotel's lawn gallery for lunch after Sunday church services, the Methodists and Presbyterians rushing there to beat the Baptists. With that, let me introduce Bonnie. Bonnie is from a very extended Florida family in Tampa, and I asked one of her cousins to fill me in on the relationships, and she confused me further. And so Bonnie can explain that. But Bonnie Lykes completed her master's in fine arts degree in 2021 at Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York. Her short stories have been published in literary outlets such as the New Orleans Review, the Penman Review, Blue Stem Magazine, the Coachella Journal, and Jonah Magazine. She hosted and produced the radio program Writer's Voice on WIOX in Roxbury, New York, and What's Happening in New Haven, a Connecticut arts program with WPKN from 2016 to 2021. Beyond creative and radio for the arts, she helped found the Reservoir Food Pantry, a nonprofit food assistance organization in the Catskill Mountains of New York. To continue food health advocacy, she and her husband, Sean, who is here with us today, are currently co-producing a podcast for Alachua County highlighting the art of homesteading and local farmers market producers. With a long family line rooted in the state of Florida, she is delighted to be living in Gainesville, and she currently is docent for the Historic Thomas Center. Will be welcoming fourth grade students to the center in 2023 for tours. So now tell us more about what you're going to be doing for those fourth grade students, Bonnie.
Well, thank you so much, Roy. Thank you. Thank you very much for all the detailed information, much of which is not included in my talk. And I really appreciate learning more from you. So, hello. It is my great pleasure to speak to you about the Historic Thomas Center this morning. And I'll wait for the screen. Thank you. Thank you, Julianne. Fantastic. Excellent. And we want to go full screen there. Excellent. Thank you so much. But I speak to you about the Historic Thomas Center today from the vantage point as a relatively new Gainesville resident, and even more recently, a new docent at the center. And special thanks to the Thomas Center Associates for allowing me to take on that role. But on my very first visit back a couple of years ago to attend a vivacious creative writing event, one of the many community events hosted there, I found the property and all the creative expression it encouraged, such as the gallery exhibits, the diverse calendar of events, quite magnetic. And along with the overall beauty of the grounds, I felt instantly attached. So I had to find out, what is it about the Thomas Center that attracts all this wonderful energy? By and by, I came to inform myself that this is truly a unique place. So back in 1910, and I'll be repeating some of what Roy Hunt has already related, but back in 1910, a good 15 years before the expansive hotel renovation, the very first resident, Major William Reuben Thomas, with his family, seemed to imbue the property with proactive vision, along with many passionate individuals to follow over the years, of course. Moreover, the center's various incarnations all possess a progression forward for the local community, just as Major Thomas likely would have encouraged himself in the early 1900s. So the people who love this place generate a love of community and an intention to adapt and rise up to meet the town of Gainesville. And this is what I hope to express to you in part today. I'm excited to take you on a virtual tour of the Cultural Affairs Wing this morning, but I need to warn you beforehand that I will be bouncing to and from timelines, but I'll let you know when I'm doing that and state which one I'm referring to. So before we dive in, here is a quick flyover of the span we'll be looking at. The timelines include the initial family home years from 1910 to the mid-1920s, the following Hotel Thomas era, beginning 1928 to the mid-1960s, then the sale of the property and subsequent 7-year lease to Santa Fe College, ending in 1974, and then the great rescue from the wrecking ball and declaration as a National Historical Landmark. This status, which of course helped fund the renovation in the mid-1970s, which then lands us to the expansive modern era with the property's current uses as home to Gainesville city offices and a thriving cultural center. So here is a very early photo of the family home, now the Cultural Affairs Wing. So this remarkable place did indeed have its beginnings as residence to Major William Reuben Thomas, his wife Catherine, and their 5 children. Construction did begin in 1906, and Major Thomas purchased the partially finished house, as Roy explained, in 1909 when his banking colleague, the original owner, passed away before it was finished. Named the Sun-Kissed Villa, the building was completed in 1910, and the Thomas family moved in. On that very day, quite auspiciously, their youngest child and only daughter, Margaret, was born in an upstairs room. And you'll hear more about her and her brother, John Henry, as we go along. The property spanned 6.2 acres. The house covered 15,000 square feet, and an outdoor atrium was the central interior. There were 21 rooms, 7 baths, and 12 fireplaces. Decorative elements of the family home were indeed kept intact with the 1928 hotel renovation, and many are still visible today. So today we have 2 wings to the center, what was the family home and the later built hotel guest room wing, later renovated as the current incarnation of city offices, as was the family home, also renovated as the current cultural center, respectfully giving us now the 2 wings, buildings A and B, A being cultural affairs and B being city offices. For Hotel Thomas, The family home was renovated for public dining, guest lounges, and lobby reception for the hotel. The second floor was kept for the Thomases' private use. For the hotel renovation, Major Thomas did indeed choose the architectural style Mediterranean Revival. The property is perfectly situated in Gainesville's romantic Duck Pond neighborhood, surrounded by several historically landmarked homes, the exteriors of which anyone can enjoy on a walking tour. So let's begin to take a closer look. We'll be going inside and out, but to get started, let's gather at the portico of the Cultural Affairs Wing. Pictured there on the left, this is the spot outside where visitors enter for tours and events, and where docents meet the grade school classes and the general public. Around the corner from that door, there on the right of the screen, is what we could call the historical entry for Building A, where Hotel Thomas received guests. It's now protected from wear and tear and not used, but the grandeur of this beautiful entrance on the right is worth a look here. Framing the stairs in the faraway photo, you can maybe just barely make out two canine figures, a pair of whippets, recast in the 1970s to a darker color, featured there in the forefront. The tiny picture in the center is Major Thomas's granddaughter, Little Miss Marie, having fun writing one of the originals. So now our tours do indeed gather at the doorway there on the left. Let's get past the threshold and head inside, where we'll see a portrait of Major Thomas welcoming everyone who pays a visit here. This portrait is indeed just past the door, and the first thing visitors see in the Cultural Affairs Wing, which was the family home between 1910 to the mid-1920s. So let's turn our spotlight to just who Major William Reuben Thomas was. Well, his ambitions and the vision with which he navigated his various business ventures, of which there were an astonishingly high number, were executed extremely well. In fact, his balance of risk-taking and good faith in others is impressive in any era, but especially during his time, considering the economic challenges of the Great Depression. And anecdotal sources do reveal he was a genuinely social person, so it's easy to speculate that this connective friendliness helped generate his financial success. And so it's appropriate his portrait greet visitors, because as we take a deeper look at his actions in the community, it's clear he believed in the value of bringing people together. This room off to the right, coming from the front entry, is now named the Long Gallery. But pictured here during the hotel years, it was the dining hall for Hotel Thomas beginning in 1928, and it was known as the best place to eat in Gainesville. There isn't a photo available of the family years from 1910 in my research, but during their time, this space was divided into two rooms. The far half was the dining room, which was adorned with Mrs. Thomas's collection of fancy painted plates on the paneled walls. And the closer half was a music studio for the youngest Thomas, Miss Margaret. Her brother, John Henry, would practice piano in the parlor, and apparently they would run up and down the hall to check up on each other. Today, this room is still undivided as with the hotel and is used for a variety of functions. So if we were indeed actually standing inside the Long Gallery there, I'd now ask you to follow me out the interior double doors and gather in the center of the Spanish court. But before we move on, let's pause for a closer look at the Thomas family, in particular, Major Thomas, before we continue on through the building. The photo on the right shows Major Thomas circa 1940, so he's in his early 60s there, posing somewhere on the property. He was born in 1866, a Gainesville native, to a highly reputable physician and his wife. He also had a sister, and he was the youngest of three sons. After his college years, he began a multifaceted career path, starting out as a school principal, as Roy mentioned to us, in Fort Meade, Florida, then moved back to Gainesville to be the chair of languages at a co-ed military school where he did earn that honorary rank of major. He dove his ambitions into politics, winning the post as senator for Alachua County for the state of Florida from 1895 to 1897. In 1896, he married Catherine May Krause of Brunswick, Georgia, pictured there on the left. He continued on with politics as an alderman for 2 years and then went on to 6 consecutive terms as mayor of Gainesville from 1901 to 1907. He was indeed largely responsible for turning Gainesville from a brawling saloon town to a settled modern city. He helped install paved roads and sidewalks, sewer systems, and electrical lighting throughout the town. During Florida's phosphate and cotton boom years, which extended into the 1900s when Florida was a major supplier of phosphate internationally, he was a high-level banking executive and held the post as bank president with Dutton Bank from 1911 to 1918. And Major Thomas's political career mirrored his business success. He owned several retail outlets, including hardware, furniture, a livery, which he promptly exited when he spotted the transition from horse and carriage to the automobile. He owned an electrical supply company. He opened lodging for travelers passing through Gainesville named Hotel White near the railroad station. He also established a tin can tourist camp, which I'll talk about and show you a photo of shortly. Land development was also a featured venture. Eventually, when his children grew and after the First World War ended, there was a boom in tourism, and he saw the city of Gainesville definitely was in need of a resort hotel. By and by, so happened the transition of home to Hotel Thomas, fully realized in 1928. But his most long-lasting contribution is certainly the establishment of the University of Florida in 1905. And it was wonderful to hear Roy's details on all of this. He was in tough competition for this with other cities. He won the petition with the promise of free water indeed, Gainesville's high moral values, and his large donation of land. Subsequently, the university named one of its first buildings on campus after him, Thomas Hall. That's Thomas Hall. Of course, the university has had long-reaching effects extending to an international level to this day. So I'm sure you agree, this is an incredible resume, and his style of investment was certainly a wellspring for the city of Gainesville. Before Hotel Thomas was born as a land use venture, Major Thomas also founded Gainesville's Tin Can Tourist Camp after World War I. He made the camp completely free for these campers who often traveled with canned food in their car trunks because it was cheap and resisted spoiling. But to highlight the rustic hardship of this style of tourism, I'd like to share with you a detailed overview on Florida tin can tourist history, just what this phenomenon was like. And while what I'm about to read may strike you as a non sequitur, you'll find it not only relates to Florida history, but will illuminate William Thomas's social inclusiveness and visionary investment strategies. So as I read, consider his forward wisdom in investing in the tin can tourist population. Here's what these folks were like. Quote, in the early 1900s, auto camping was in its infancy. Travelers' outfits were no more than an old model car, a tent, a few cooking utensils, and some blankets. Many had for shelter merely a strip of canvas stretched between the car to a couple of stakes in the ground. Some merely cut the supports of the car's front seats and tilted them backward to form a bed. And a box bolted on the running board of the car to hold supplies completed their equipment. There were no public camping grounds nor parks maintained for these campers. They would stop on a private property, village common, a school or churchyard along the roadside, or even a cemetery. Anywhere that water was obtainable with room to park and camp. Many of these early campers were not too particular of their personal habits. Some left their campsites littered. Some left the campfires burning. Some used fences of their hosts for their firewood, and too many purloined farmers' chickens, potatoes, or fruit when they left. The whole movement was soon looked upon as a band of gypsies, unwanted, undesirable, and something to keep out of neighborhoods. It soon became difficult for any camper, no matter how honest or careful, to get permission to camp near other habitation. At this time, the roads were usually as crude as the equipment. This caused them to travel in groups, helping each other through mud and sand, As the number of campers grew larger, the camping conditions worsened, end quote. So William Thomas's hope was to have them spend time in Gainesville to hopefully inspire a permanent move to the city. And I find this especially interesting because once again, Thomas was steady on the pulse of a social trend and really a very intimidating phenomenon and responded in a positive, forward-thinking way. In my opinion, it's a luminous piece of state history and one that we can look back on with fascination. So in conclusion, we see how Major William Thomas rose up to answer the call on behalf of the tin can tourist population and the city of Gainesville. So now let's turn our attention to the Thomas children. Here they are pictured all together circa 1910. Going clockwise from 12 o'clock, we have the Major's namesake, William Reuben, then Clarence, then little John Henry, Miss Margaret in her chair, and then Philip in his bow tie. And visiting school children on tours often take note of John Henry's clothing in this photo. In those days, longer hair and long tunics on little boys was very common, of course. And now looking at the house there in the top left photo, we see extending porches encircling a good section of the top floor. These porches have long been removed and are a distinct feature of the family home years because they were meant for the Thomas children. In those days, it was believed that children were healthier if they slept outside year-round, and that's exactly what the Thomas children did. The boys had their sleeping porch, and Margaret had hers. And of course, for major storms, they were all likely brought inside. But the porches had these pull-down tarpaulin blinds, providing a slim barrier to the elements. So as you can imagine, these porches likely got pretty gritty from exposure. And when the children were older, it was John Henry's job to sweep the boys' porch and Margaret's job to sweep hers. Lo and behold, they would wear roller skates, pictured there at the bottom, to get the job done. Miss Margaret's dressing room, where she accessed her porch, is now a city office, so when we go upstairs on our tour this morning, we'll need to use our imaginations to visualize her access point. However, I will be able to show you exactly where the boys accessed their porch. Now let's take a closer look at how little Miss Margaret and her brother John Henry interacted together. Here is a picture of Miss Margaret and her brother John Henry in their third grade class at Kirby Smith Elementary. Hopefully you can see their faces circled with white rings there. He's top left and she's in the second row on the right. They weren't in the same grade, but Margaret was always hovering nearby because John Henry had a speech impediment. They called it tongue-tied in those days, but she understood him perfectly and would interpret his speech for him. This made their bond very strong. Years later, he did overcome this and grew up to be a physician. And it's plain to see in a slide I'll show you a bit later that as young adults, they were always the best of friends. It was after the children grew, Gainesville boom fever was in full swing, and Major Thomas also went full swing ahead to promote the concept of a resort hotel and donated the family home toward that goal in the mid-1920s. And while he did not seek public office again, he remained very active in community affairs. He launched an action program to get the house transformed into a large-scale resort with the rest of the property, of course. So after a successful bond sale with Gainesville citizens using his own assets as collateral, the renovation was launched. He published a heartfelt thank you to the people of Gainesville in the Gainesville Daily Sun. So a brand new 3-story wing of guest rooms was constructed and a promotion was designed to attract hotel guests. In the lower right corner there, we see a little slice of a guest room for the brochure. The rooms had no air conditioning, in those days, but each room did have its own bathroom, which was luxurious and unusual for most hotels in that day. Hotel Thomas enjoyed a reputation as a hotspot for many high social occasions, as well as more casual community functions. There also used to be an officers' club in the hotel basement, which was also frequented by university students, particularly in the 1940s. So you can imagine all the goings-on that would happen at the hotel, which I'll tell you more about as we head into the Spanish Court area. So aiming our eyes now to the black and white picture there on the far left, we'll see how what we now call the Spanish court really went through a remarkable transition. As the Thomas home there on the left, we see the early expression of a sunken garden in what was the atrium. A later photo is not available, so we have to use our imaginations a little here because it appears it was not a mature garden as yet. But imagine the atrium filled with ferns and Mrs. Thomas's beloved rose bushes, a poinsettia plant that stretched all the way to a screened ceiling, and during storms, the rain would fall right down to the atrium floor. Major Thomas's daughter, Margaret, also recalled, quote, "There were definitely some banana trees in there too." And the dark mass in the foreground is not a bush or shrub, that's actually a fountain. The atrium had 3 covered porches. You can see part of a staircase there, and winding paths led to the unique looking pyramid shaped fountain where the children would get washed up after playing outside to then head upstairs for baths. They loved this atrium and had many fond memories of playing there. So now moving to the center here, we see 1928 Hotel Thomas time. With the hotel renovation, a dome-shaped glass roof was installed with tarpaulins that regulated incoming light. The floor was poured and raised, and essentially it became an enclosed space, no longer exposed. The hotel hosted many social functions in the Spanish court, everything from dinners to fancy ball dances. Pictured there on the top center left, we see the court set up with tables, ladies playing bridge. The card game was all the rage in the 1930s. And Hotel Thomas would also host inexpensive, even sometimes free, lunches for Gainesville residents to come mix with Northern hotel guests, another socially inclusive concept of Major Thomas's. In an interview, Margaret has related, quote, "Father did not hold the lunches to make money. That wasn't the point." There on the center bottom, there's Margaret O'Maria Thomas becoming Mrs. Samuel Hawkins as bride for her wedding. In a few moments, I'll show you an image where we'll see her beautiful veil, which she generously donated to the center. And her wedding was a major hotel event. She'd fallen in love with a hotel guest from up north, Mr. Samuel Hawkins, an attorney. The wedding took place in 1935 there in the Spanish court. And in going over my docent materials, there were signs of a previous docent's interview with Margaret before she passed away in 2002. And written in faded pencil in the margin of my book, she'd apparently shared a story that the ceremony was about to start and Sam, her groom, had lost his tie. So they borrowed one from a hotel waiter. And you can see the hotel wait staff there in the center right photo. Anyway, her new husband, Sam, helped run the hotel and brought many guests down from the north to stay there. Now we move to the group of color photos on the right. We have a collage of more modern times. This is still a very active and exciting space. Today, the Spanish court hosts all manner of community events, musical performances, dances, weddings, poetry readings, educational lectures, just to name a few. So perhaps you have attended several events at the Thomas Center yourself, and Christmas is a time when the center really comes alive with celebration and a strong sense of community. Just in case you've never experienced a gathering at the Thomas Center during this time of year, here is a short film from 2011 showing the holiday tree lighting and festivities, with the Gainesville commissioner narrating. But this footage really shows how the center pretty much turns into a collective living room. Whether in the Spanish court or out in the garden, both settings are glorious for the holidays. So let's get this going here.
Well, happy holidays from the Thomas Center here on the first Saturday of December. The traditional lighting of the city tree in the Thomas Center, and at the same time, of course, taking advantage of the beautiful decorations by the Thomas Center Associates at the Thomas Center. And of course, as you can see behind me, we have Santa visiting, taking wishes for kids, pictures. Wonderful job. Santa Dennis does this every year for us as a volunteer activity. And you might just hear clip-clop going by. 2 wagons drawn by horses that each year the Duck Pond Neighborhood Association sponsors. And so it's a really wonderful combination of music, lights, activities, Santa, and a little bit of music. Everybody coming out and celebrating this terrific time of year. And this event is a terrific example of the neighborhood coming together and organizing this event. Community-wide folks coming and enjoying that and partaking in that, and of course the city being a part of that. So it's a really great combination of all those three.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hi, this is Commissioner Randy Wells wishing all of our citizens and employees a very happy holidays and Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.
And it just so happens the Jingle Bell Ball is tomorrow evening. So now let's take our tour outdoors to expand on a little history. Jumping back to the Hotel Thomas era, there on the left, we see a little girl's dance recital sometime around 1932. And whether hotel or cultural center, the property has engaged children to discover their own history through tours and education through the arts. On the right, jumping to a more modern decade, we see the Outdoors Children's Theater constructed in 1986, a repurposing of a neglected storm retention area, another space that underwent a remarkable transformation to a usable, beautiful community asset. Built-in benches were designed locally, and the space was made into a small-scale amphitheater. The official title is the Grace and Sydney Knight Children's Theater and was dedicated as a golden wedding anniversary gift to the community. The very first production presented on the stage was Romeo and Juliet. The outdoor garden area is lush with beauty and history. The photos here do no justice. Of course, much more wonderful to visit in person. On the far right, we see the fountain erected for Hotel Thomas, framed by a circular plaza with live oak and magnolia trees. In the center image, the Turtle Court, situated between buildings A and B. Many lavish events have taken place in this space since and during the Hotel Thomas days, such as the grand engagement party Miss Margaret threw for her dear friend in the 1930s. And there on the right, the Faber Memorial Pergola, designed for quiet reveries and curved benches, giving a vantage point to the entire garden. This was designed in memory of the landscaper Thomas Faber. The garden's reclamation was an ongoing community effort with the Thomas Center Associates and the City of Gainesville, along with other civic groups. The gardens were awarded a Meritorious Achievement Award by the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation in 1989, and the care and beauty of this outstanding aspect of the Thomas Center has cited national attention. Since we've landed outside, let's take a peek now, jumping back in time to the Thomas home era, 1924 to be exact, at a different section the 6.2 acreage property spanned. Here is something of an architectural miracle. In 1924, there was indeed a barn located on the north end of the property, which housed the dairy cows that serviced Major Thomas's smaller hospitality venture, Hotel White. In 1924, he sold this particular parcel on the Thomas home property to a developer who literally split the barn into 2 beautiful homes. After a lot of stucco and other materials, they became the residences to 2 leading Gainesville families, the Farr Adkins family, and the Pepper family. Before the splitting, you can see a little garret there on top of the barn. The Thomas children loved to hide away in there. There's also a glimpse of a white cottage on the right there, which began as an exercise room for the children, but in later years it was furnished for esteemed hotel guests who required a little extra privacy, such as the writer Robert Frost. Helen Keller was also a guest at Hotel Thomas. So heading back into the Cultural Affairs Building's interior, we're going to look at a room now that simultaneously holds our three timelines. This room, located just off the Spanish Court, is officially named the Sam Gowan History Room. Sam Gowan was the driving force behind the historic Gainesville Committee, who helped establish the Thomas Center as a nationally known landmark and ultimately saved it from being torn down in the mid-1970s. In the center there, we see the sundial that stands in the garden donated by the Gowan family. And nearby that, there in the garden, there is a plaque in memory to Mr. Sam Gowan. This room is also affectionately called the 1928 room. And in the glass cases, we see all the goings-on culturally and internationally when the hotel opened. For example, the Alexander Fleming invention of penicillin, Mickey Mouse, fashion accessories of the day, 1928 ads for phosphate soap, Firestone gas and oil, and there's a radio and typewriter there on the shelf from that era too. For the Thomas household, the children ate lunch in this room, promptly delivered by a bellman from Hotel White, especially brought over in a tin-lined wicker basket designed by Major Thomas to keep their food warm. Then during the hotel years, it was known as the breakfast room and was also a space used for private dinners. The neighboring room, which also straddles the Spanish Court, is named the Lucille T. Maloney Conference Room. And this is where the Thomas Center Associates typically hold their meetings. Ms. Maloney is the namesake as founding member of the TCA. For the Thomas family, this room was a library. And the windows in this room are called hopper windows. They open to a slant inward, and they're high up because there was glass-fronted bookcases on the walls below them. Also, when the courtyard was an open atrium, there, of course, was no air conditioning, so this style of window allowed air to circulate to the warmest part of the room. Apparently, Miss Margaret and John Henry loved to sit in large leather chairs here and read their father's books. Framed in this room on the left, we see a very special donation, a bridal veil, donated by Margaret Thomas Hawkins when she became Mrs. Samuel Hawkins in 1935 in the Spanish Court. Her father gifted her yards of Italian lace after his trip to Italy, long before she was marrying age. And when the time came, a local Gainesville seamstress fashioned her dress and veil. Of course, Major Thomas was likely very happy to see his gift come to his daughter's nuptial fruition. And I believe she also passed it down to her daughters to use as well. And also there, we see Mrs. Thomas's gift to her daughter, something borrowed, something blue, with an Italian lace handkerchief and cameo from their travels abroad as well. During the Hotel Thomas days, this room was a multi-purpose lounge, occasionally used for private parties or salesmen's displays. The table there used for meetings is custom made and patterned after the one featured in the hotel brochure. A little mystery about this room is that on the far left window, outside the photo, unfortunately, is a mysterious diamond shape of red glass. There's speculation it did come from the time of the Santa Fe College era, beginning in 1968. These years were pretty rough on the building, but it looks as though the window had been mended in an offbeat way. The college offered stained glass classes, so there's a theory that perhaps the teacher or maybe a student whipped up a little red piece of glass to repair the window. And while we're thinking about Santa Fe College, we'll give a quick nod here to the sale of the property in the mid-1960s. The new owners, two gentlemen by the names of Haynes and Stedham, decided to lease the property for 5 years, then extended it to 7 years to Santa Fe College starting in 1968. But in spite of the wear and tear on the building, it's good to note that once again, even though maintenance was in a lull, the property was repurposed and rose up to meet the town of Gainesville in a whole new way. So still on the ground floor now, let's pop over to the beautiful parlor. The theme of this room throughout both the home and hotel years was definitely relaxation. This was a place to write letters, maybe a bit of needlepoint if you were female, sip on a hot or cold drink, or maybe John Henry or Margaret would show off their music lessons on the piano, the very same one still standing from the Thomas home. We also see a Victrola. Perhaps Major and Mrs. Thomas might waltz to a record, or in later years, maybe a hotel guest would spin the handle to fire up the Charleston. And during the hotel era, the soothing comfort of this room continued as a lounge for guests. It wasn't until 1963 that the city of Gainesville did issue permits to serve alcohol. As Roy had mentioned, permit number 1 went into this space, and it quickly became a very popular spot to have a cocktail. The hotel manager during that time was British, so he was likely the reason this room was named the Cornish Arms, and it was such a popular spot. University students frequented here as well. Just past the historic hotel lobby area, let's take a peek now at where the brilliance of business came about. Major Thomas's office, which is right across from the parlor. If we were standing outside the door, we'd see a dictaphone on his desk where he likely recorded important details for pursuits or reminders of meetings and acquisitions. But if we were there in person, you'd also see something else not at all surprising. Curators placed a medicine bottle on the desk, indicated for a sour stomach. It's not a surprise that Major Thomas suffered from a great deal of stress because of all the responsibility he navigated on a regular basis. The little leather chair on the center line of the left photo is from one of his actual very business pursuits. It was a chair used at White Electric. The Thomas grandchildren all remember this great big roll-top desk. Now it's time to head upstairs, and there's something very special right between the 2 floors on the landing. Here we see daughter Margaret's bassinet, another beautiful gift from Mrs. Margaret Thomas Hawkins, and it is in perfect condition. We also see a special display collage on the landing there as well, which essentially describes what I'm relating here. As mentioned at the start of our tour, she was indeed born on the next floor the day the Thomases moved in. I can only imagine the stress and concern that went on until they knew mother and daughter were stable, but at least Mrs. Thomas had been through it 4 times before. So this beautiful bassinet sits very close to where Margaret's mother gave birth to her on our next floor, the 2nd floor. And now we land there, 2nd floor, overlooking the Spanish Court and what was the outdoor atrium in the family home. The Thomas children loved to skate around this looping breezeway here. In the photo on the right, we see Miss Margaret and her brother John Henry as young adults, likely close to when the hotel renovation occurred, ever the best of pals. And the sleeping porches featured in the photo on the bottom there were removed when the home transitioned to Hotel Thomas. This floor, which now houses Gainesville City staff offices, was where the children's dressing rooms were and the entrances to their sleeping porches. And it was also where their parents' separate bedrooms were, one of which we'll see next. What's interesting to note on this floor is that all the rooms, bathrooms, closets were connected interiorly. So the family didn't actually have to use this breezeway here, but apparently the children preferred using the exterior walkway, no matter the temperature, from the outdoor atrium. During the hotel era, this floor was still in private use for the Thomases. Besides bedrooms and dressing rooms, there were sitting lounges with fireplaces, spaces of that nature, and also a special guest room for visiting relatives and friends. As we move down the breezeway, we arrive at Major Thomas's private bedroom. On the right photo of the collage, you'll see what looks to be an open bathroom door, but it's actually what the French call a trompe-l'oeil, something to trick the eye. When you're standing in front of this room, you can tell the bathroom is actually a painting on the wall there, and the artist even painted a hanging towel on the handle to add to the realism. But it's important the bathroom be represented. There is a story that goes along with it, you see. One day, a doctor visited the home to remove Miss Margaret's tonsils right in that bathroom. John Henry was supposed to follow with his tonsillectomy after Margaret's, ladies being first, the chosen order apparently. When little John Henry heard her subsequent screams, he took off like a rocket, ran away, not to be found for a lengthy long time. Finally, they did find John Henry. One can only imagine that he found a spectacular hiding spot somewhere on the property, but in spite of his retreat, he underwent the same procedure as his sister in that little bathroom. Another quick reference to this room was that the window in the right photo there was the entryway to the boys' sleeping porch. So when they came up as teenagers, Major Thomas always knew who did and who did not get to bed on time. Shortly, we'll take our tour through the art installations, but now we come to the final area of the second floor tour, having passed the boys' dressing rooms and other lounges, etc. Near the stairwell where we came up, we'd be standing in the vicinity of Mrs. Catherine Thomas's room, her private bedroom, and cannot actually produce a photo because it is now a private city office. In the photo on the right, she's pictured there with her first three born, the three boys, William Reuben, Clarence, and Philip. This photo is prior to the sun-kissed villa era, taken when the family lived what was Masonic Avenue, but is now Southwest 2nd Avenue. I haven't mentioned Mrs. Thomas with a lot of detail, but would like to end this tour with what I do know of her story. Sadly, she did not live in the house long, only about 5 years. It seems she was diagnosed with a slow growth brain tumor. And at first, a hired nurse tended to her care, but it was determined that she move into a medical facility permanently. With some irony, she did outlive her husband, Major Thomas, who passed away in 1943, and she in 1948. Mrs. Catherine Thomas maintained over 300 rose bushes in a large circular garden and inside the atrium, too. Her love of those rose bushes is now represented in the garden with the Katie Thomas Rose Trellis, an entry point from the surrounding neighborhood. And I'd like to share a direct quote from her daughter, Margaret, from a past interview. Margaret remembered her mother as, quote, a sweet, good woman, beautiful and refined. In spite of a quieter presence in the Thomas household history, she made her gentle, memorable mark. So now let's take a look at a modern inclusion to the second floor before we leave. Moving on to the visual art exhibits, which are a constant at the Thomas Center, let's consider a very talented individual whose work is currently on display on the second floor. This gentleman pictured here was a man named Jesse Aaron. He was a multi-talented person, a renowned cook at the hotel in the 1930s, very well known for his fantastic pies, breads, and cakes. But when he was in his early 80s, his wife desperately needed cataract surgery, and one day Jesse Aaron had a divine calling. He heard the voice of God telling him to begin wood sculpting as an art. His work became extremely well known, and it's featured in world-class museums such as the Smithsonian Institute to this day. You can see his unique and amazing work. It bears mentioning again that his sculptures are on display throughout the second floor of the center. Now a further look at the art installations. Let's peek at the downstairs gallery. This space is at the far end of the Spanish court, and although it was kitchen for both home and hotel, it is a dedicated art space and shows no remnants of those historical eras. Currently, we have the exhibit entitled Out of the Woods. This is a collaboration of artists who produced work which features narrative and figurative expressions made of wood, displayed alongside literary excerpts from a novel, The Overstory by Richard Powers, published in 2018. The storyline tells of 9 Americans whose unique experiences with trees bring them together to address the destruction of the forests. So the exhibit is a collection of work by artists who connect to nature through the intimate experience of working with wood. A wonderful visual collaboration inspired by the Powers novel. We encourage your visit to absorb the information about the artists and this collection, ideally at your own leisure. Now that we've covered an overview of the exhibits, I have another little video to share. I found it on YouTube, and this little film offers one person's individual perspective and obvious affection for the Thomas Center. And it also offers really a nice summative flyover of our virtual visit today. By the way, one of the later frames in this video references Doris Barden, who was a driving force in the arts community in Gainesville, and as I've gathered, she is very fondly remembered. The permanent exhibit is also mentioned, the paintings of Eddie Muma. It's featured at the end of this video, and I believe it is still currently hanging throughout the second floor office spaces. So before we wrap up, I'd like to give a quick nod to the importance of our historical buildings. Driving around any neighborhood, we see how styles of architecture certainly emote a community's character and energy. Older buildings, especially those built prior to World War II, are often made of higher quality materials. Put simply, they're made to last. So it makes economic sense to retain these places. Properties like the Thomas Center help people maintain a sense of place and connection to the past, and respectful maintenance of history is a potential tonic for everyone, whether a building, object, or primary resource chronicle or anecdote. These landmarks and their artifacts represent the successes and failures of human beings and their communities. We can engage them to express creativity, education, and to see what has happened to our human family in tangible view. So looking back with discernment is important to everyone and anyone, local, non-local, and happily, no matter the personal background or age. It has been my pleasure to speak to you today, and I hope that the dashing in and out of timelines was more stimulating than confusing. But if you would like to purchase the wonderful book that's beautifully arranged, which gives a full overview of the Thomas Center, it's listed at the top of the next slide on the bibliography. I'm holding it up here. It is available on the Thomas Center Associates website, or you can pick up an order form at the front entry table on your next visit. It provides a lot of detail and anecdote and legalities that I couldn't squeeze in today. So now we can open up the floor. If anyone has something to share, maybe a memory or even a correction you'd like to make. If I've left anything out that should be mentioned, please feel free to express it. And if anyone does have a question, I'll do my best to answer. Thank you so very much for listening today.
Thank you, Bonnie. And are there questions or observations?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
We were privileged to take classes at the Thomas Center back in the 70s when it was under Santa Fe, and to see it restored. And we attended the Jingle Bell Ball 2 years ago there, and to see it in its glory now is just magnificent. You've done a wonderful job, Bonnie, of collating this information, and it was such an interesting presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for that feedback. And it's always delightful to hear somebody with their own affection and memories for the Thomas Center. I feel that the property is quite literally imbued with all those good, positive memories and thoughts. Thank you very much.
And there's a chat question for you.
Oh, yes. We have a chat question. One person is asking, can one get on a monthly email list to know what activities are going on? I would say a big thumbs up to that. What I recommend doing is going to the Thomas Center Associates website. And that actually was there on the bibliography. But if you Google the Thomas Center Associates or the Historic Thomas Center, I'm sure there is a way to contact somebody to get that monthly newsletter. Thank you for asking.
Are there others on Zoom who are?
I don't see any others on Zoom, but is the Jingle Bell Ball the same as the lighting? Is that when?
I think that, that is a very good question, Julianne, because Sean and I were coming to the center at sort of during the tail end of COVID. And so we were wondering if things had been moved outdoors. I think that Jingle Bell Ball did occur last year, but perhaps they had more things going on outside. The tree lighting that we attended out on the grounds last year was spectacular. So I'm not sure if there's 2 trees or 1, but maybe somebody would know the answer to that.
Tallulah, let me bring you the microphone.
Oh, Tallulah, yes. Hi, Tallulah, yes.
Hi, Bonnie. You did a magnificent job. And it reminded me so much of the way that I have always felt about the Thomas Center, because coming from Miami, I looked at Vizcaya and I thought, oh, that's it, But then when I got to Gainesville, I looked around for Vizcaya and it wasn't here, but the Thomas Center was.
Oh.
And I felt that it could serve many of the same public interests that you have spoken about today.
Yes, thank you.
But the Jingle Bell Ball is this Friday night.
Tomorrow night.
Yes. I don't
Yes.
know if tickets are still available. The last I heard, they had about 10 left.
Oh, it sells out quickly, I've heard.
Oh, very quickly.
Yes, indeed.
Very quickly. Yeah. So love to see you there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it myself. Thank you so much.
I don't see any other questions. Roy?
I would make one correction.
Yes, please, sir. Absolutely.
The Thomas Center, as wonderful as it is not a National Historic Landmark.
Oh,
There are 47 National Historic Landmarks in the state of Florida, and we're fortunate in having 2 of them in Alachua County, Dudley Farm and the Marjorie Canaan Rawlings Farm. The issue, of course, is national significance. And while the Thomas Center is clearly of state significance and it's listed individually on the National Register of Historic Places because of that significance, it's not an NHL.
I see. Thank you for that correction. I guess I misinterpreted from the book. It's possible that I threw in that word mistakenly.
National Register of Historic Places is, again,
That's
at a
yeah.
level of state significance.
Understood. Thank you. Duly noted.
Thank you so much for being here. Again, it's a long time coming, but it was worth it. And if there's anyone here who has not visited the Thomas Center, I urge you to do so. I go there often. Thank you, and I guess that's it.
Thank you. Have a beautiful day and happy December, everybody. Thanks.